people that scapegoat the minorities, scapegoat the Muslims, the Roma gypsies, blacks, whatever group. It used to be the Irish, it used to be Catholics, now it's Muslims. It's the same story. Rather than trying to inspire class consciousness among British people, by that I mean recognition that you have more in common with your fellow working man, whatever color he is, than you have in common with your bosses, the bosses who live by exploitation, that you should be divided up by race. That's how they want you to. It's divide and rule. Classic divide and rule. They're knowing like I said earlier, British people, yes, year by year are becoming more liberal, more tolerant. Whether it's gay marriage, whether it's racial, opinions. Like I said, British people, only 8% of the British public have negative attitude towards black people. It's something like not even 1% of British people are anti-Semitic. Now the problem with Muslims is different. So with the statistics I've read, yes, Muslims are the second most hated group in Britain. About 40% of the British public have negative attitudes towards Muslims. The only group in Britain that gets more negative opinion is Roma gypsies. Roma gypsies get far more, even than Muslims, they get more negative attention, right?
Because the Muslims don't promote themselves properly, better, or do you think it's...
Well, look, I'm an atheist. I'm anti-religion. No, I'm very firmly anti-religion. I think Islam is not a valid ideology to uphold. Same with Christianity.
Okay.
I mean, I think religion is a form of magical thinking. It has no place in a modern, industrialized, scientific society. I mean, I believe that, but Muslims as people are fine. I mean, I've never met a Muslim guy I didn't think was a decent guy. Maybe they're out there, but and I think we have to remember that the far right are not that serious about tackling radical Islam. When you talk to the average far right person in Britain, I'm not talking about the average Tory. I'm talking about the kind of sometimes come here to Speaker's Corner, the EDL types. They're not serious about tackling radical Islam.
No, they're not.
Where do you ever hear them talking about Britain selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, the most radical Islamic state in the world? Where do you ever hear them complaining about Britain's alliances with Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Qatar, where they turn a blind eye to all the radicalization of mainstream Sunni Islam in those countries? You don't hear British far-right activists talking about that. They're angry about these so-called pedo gangs, right? Or these pedo rings, which, as far as I've seen, don't have much evidence to support them. It seems very conspiratorial, a lot of it. If it is there, it is a problem. It's something to talk about. But if you're serious about dealing with radical Islam, dealing with Salafism, Wahhabism, all those toxic ideologies which have been spreading around the Middle East, then you have to address the British elite's role in propping up those regimes, like Saudi, like Pakistan, like Qatar, right? Where this ideology is being fermented, spread throughout all the schools there. Yeah, please go ahead, my friend. Go ahead.
Nice to see you.
Nice to talk to you.
My video a few weeks back.
Nice to see you. Good video. Yeah, go ahead. Just speak loudly so everyone can hear you.
All right, saying about toxic ideologies like Salafism, Wahhabism, and vice versa. I'd just like to respectfully correct something that you said with regards to Salafism, for example. And I don't disagree there are extreme Muslims when it comes to the way in which their misinterpretation.
Speak louder, man. People can't hear you.
Their misinterpretation of the religion, slaughtering innocent Muslims, Christians, and vice versa. I agree with you.
It's still real Islam.
But
just because you don't like it doesn't make it not Islam.
Sorry?
I remember when there was a Muslim attack carried out. I think it was in a bank somewhere in London. It was a little bit after the London attacks, the stabbing attacks. And then there was a Muslim guy saying to him, he said, "You ain't no Muslim, bro," something like that. That's not true. Just because someone's behaving badly doesn't make them not a Muslim. You know what I mean? Like, I can be, if you think you're a Muslim, you are a Muslim. That's how it works. It's that simple, right? You may not behave in the right way according to another Muslim, but you're still Muslim.
But when it comes to like the religion of Islam, there's certain things which nullify somebody's faith. Like anyone can, yes, you're right. Anyone can say I'm a Muslim. For example, I'm going to say I'm a Muslim. But there are certain things which nullify your Islam and make you not Muslim anymore.
According to you. But remember, this is all magical thinking.
No.
Sorry, this is all hypothetical metaphysics.
Kyle, with respect.
Go ahead, sorry, man.
Religion itself is a religion. For example, as a Muslim, if I prostrate to an idol, that nullifies my Islam because the core teaching of Islam is monotheism. and worshipping God alone without any intermediaries.
The problem is with this discussion, it's very interesting what you're saying. I'm learning here about the way Muslims deal with heresy, right? You say praising idols. This was a big problem in Europe during the Reformation, where Catholic churches full of statues, wonderful statues, were being destroyed by Protestants in a kind of ISIS-style destruction of these so-called idols. Remember, Catholics weren't actually praying to the so-called idols. Catholics were using these statues to try and channel their prayer, right? They weren't praying to the statue of Mary, they were using that statue as a guide to help them focus on their prayers. But the Protestants came in. But you know what? None of this is, None of this is falsifiable. This is all magical thinking. I'm not here to try and discredit someone, but you're saying about whether or not someone's a Muslim or nullifies it, it's unfalsifiable. There's no way to test to see whether what you're saying is true. There's no way to test. It's like the question of whether God exists. It's all assertion. Sorry? Oh, I'm an optimist. I've always been an optimist. I've always been a glass half full person. I don't think... I had this situation with Ukraine. I'm trying to be as optimistic as possible that it will come to a swift end as soon as possible, that Ukrainian civilians will be spared more carnage, and that Zelensky will be actually listened to. Remember, like I said, the British media always listens to Zelensky when he calls for weapons, but they don't listen to Zelensky when he's calling for negotiations with Putin. That part is left out. I hope we can get an honest media that actually contains the whole of what Zelensky's trying to say, instead of just focusing on the part that suits the Western arms industry, the British arms industry, which, like I've pointed out at Speaker's Corner before, has a long history of working with both sides. In the war in the Congo, I gave the example, the terrible war that raged until there was a kind of peace accord in 2002. Britain was arming both sides. On the one hand, you had Angola, Mozambique, Zimbabwe that were fighting against the DRC's regime. And on the other hand, you had, they were fighting in favor of it. My bad. Let me make it clear. Angola fighting in favor of the DRC, and then you had Rwanda and Uganda fighting against the regime. Britain sold weapons to both sides. Britain invited representatives from both sides of the war to come to an arms fair in London in 2001, September 2001. They invited them to the arms fair and they invited them to buy weapons. Both sides. They didn't mind. It's like the Ukraine crisis. On the one hand, Britain was working with Ukraine, training up its soldiers, tens of thousands of soldiers in Ukraine benefiting from British training. On the other side, Britain was giving golden visas to Russian oligarchs to come over to London and set up shop in London, to make use of London real estate developers, accountants, corporate lawyers, a small industry set up in London to benefit these Russian oligarchs. They were working with both sides. Britain has a long history of doing this. In the Iran-Iraq war, Britain sold weapons to both sides. They were happy to work with both Iran and Iraq. They did favor Iran slightly more in that war, but they sold weapons to both sides. We'll take the example of the American Civil War. Britain said on the outside, no, we're not going to take part. We're going to let America solve this problem itself. But secretly, Britain was working with the Confederate side, the racist, slave-owning, Bible-thumping side. I pointed out Britain sold the USS Alabama. It was a gunship made in Britain, sold to the Confederate side in the Civil War, and it was used to sink more than 40 Union ships in that conflict. Britain was happy to sell that gunship. They were happy. They would have even happily intervened in the war if it wasn't for the fact that the Americans had developed by that point gunships that were superior to the British ships. They didn't want to have the Royal Navy suffer such a great loss by taking part, but they would have supported the Confederate side. This is the dark side of British history that you're not taught, that you're not exposed to. Whether it's the education system, the media, or just common discussion among British people, this is not the history that's presented. Now, I'm not saying we have to exclusively focus on the bad stuff, slave trade and so on, but it's well worth keeping in mind. This is not history that should be discounted, if not for the sake of the Kenyans, Malayans, and so on. People have suffered under British colonialism. We have to examine both sides of the story. And that doesn't make you anti-British to do that. That makes you an honest British person. Someone honestly wanting to examine their history. You talk to British people, say, I'm proud of British history. I'm proud of the empire. Well, let me ask someone like that a question. Let me put this question to them. What would you think of a man who was only proud of his achievements but never ashamed of his failures? you would not be impressed with such a one-sided, biased view of someone. A lack of self-reflection, a lack of honest examination of oneself. We should do the same to Britain. We should definitely celebrate things like D-Day, and we should celebrate the British sacrifice in World War II. I've spoken at Speaker's Corner about the British involvement in Sierra Leone in 1999. It was a very moral intervention that Britain was doing to help the people of Freetown against the RUF, the vicious, hand-chopping revolutionaries trying to take over Sierra Leone, or at least saying they were trying to take it over. Britain did actually intervene, and they put 1,000 troops in Sierra Leone to help the UN peacekeeping mission there, and it worked. I'm not against intervention. People say I'm anti-intervention as well, because I oppose things like what we did in Iraq or what we did in Afghanistan. I'm not anti-intervention. For example, Britain should have intervened in Rwanda during the genocide, but Britain didn't do anything. Britain did next to nothing. The most that Britain did was send 50 Bedford trucks from the Cold War, trucks that broke down almost as soon as they arrived. That was what Britain helped the peacekeeping mission. People like Douglas Hurd in the Foreign Office, this is according to sources from within the Foreign Office, he said in a meeting, we will not call this genocide a genocide. We won't call it that. He slammed his hand on the table, according to someone who was there at the meeting. They didn't want to call the genocide a genocide because that would have obliged Britain to act under the Genocide Convention to stop the genocide taking place. Remember, this genocide could have been easily prevented. The people committing the genocide in Rwanda, they weren't armed with machine guns, they were armed with machetes. That's what they were doing around, creating their mountains of corpses. More than 1 million people dead. It was with machetes. They could have been stopped by armored cars. They could have been stopped by armed peacekeepers, but they weren't. And Britain bears a significant responsibility in that for not taking its obligation seriously. They didn't act to intervene to stop that genocide. And I think that's something, again, another part of British history, which I try and share at Speaker's Corner, to correct for this distorted idea that we are somehow a beacon of human rights, a beacon of democracy, a beacon of free speech, international law. We uphold the rules-based international order. I had a debate with someone at Speaker's Corner, a Zionist speaker who got up and completely, without laughing, without even making a single laugh, said that Britain is a beacon of human rights. And I had to ask, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, at home, Britain is a beacon of human rights. I said, well, what about overseas? And he said, yes, overseas. Look at World War II, look at what we did to fight Germany. I said, fine. But when you put it on balance, and you actually examine what Britain's doing now, places like Qatar, the Gulf states, regimes as vicious, if not more so, than Vladimir Putin's, what kind of picture do you get? Do you get a picture of a Britain that is serious about upholding human rights? Places like Egypt, Indonesia, Nigeria, Israel. It's very much the opposite picture. We have to do much more in wider society to try and educate ourselves about this. It will be a disservice to British people if they don't know this history, I think. If they're not educated, or at least try and understand it. Right, yeah, someone like Niall Ferguson said this. Well, he said, the British Empire wasn't as bad as the Third Reich, was it? And I'm thinking to myself, you're going to use Nazi Germany as your moral standard. Take care. You're going to use Nazi Germany as your moral standard. And remember, the lesser of two evils is still an evil. There's no one saying that the British Empire was worse than the Nazis. No one's saying that, but that doesn't make Britain the British Empire a positive influence in the world. That doesn't at all make it that case. The lesser of two evils is still an evil. Right, so yes, we had our gulags in South Africa and Kenya. In South Africa, we rounded up the Boers, put them in gulags. You could see barbed wire stretching for miles in these places, right? Putting white people in there, Afrikaners, in these concentration camps. And by the way, this is where Hitler got the idea for concentration camps. It was from examining very closely the Anglo-Boer War. The British Empire put Afrikaners in these camps, women and children, as a way to try and starve out the guerrilla fighters, to make sure they wouldn't continue the struggle.
When we sleep and meditate,
You're right, a concentration camp is not necessarily a place for extermination.
yeah, it wasn't a death camp until the Nazis. And now, in our brain, it makes us feel good.
So this is why people say death. They don't just say concentration camp; they say death camp, right?
And
But again, let's not forget something very crucial about this whole conflict.
I gave you that book, but you never read it.
Throughout that entire period, American capitalism was doing business with the Nazis.
It's the way.
Companies like IG Farben. The bombing of London in the Blitz might not have happened if it wasn't for Standard Oil of New Jersey in the US selling the aviation fluid to the Nazis, which they needed to get those planes off the ground, to get the Luftwaffe to London. It was American companies doing business with the Nazis that helped them to achieve those ends. Sorry? Dunlop Tires, the Coca-Cola company. There's an interesting story about some Nazi prisoners of war taken over to the US. When they arrived in the US, they saw a billboard for Coca-Cola and they said, "Oh, you guys have Coke too." You know, it's an idea that it should unsettle you. You have this position that somehow the West was on the side of freedom and democracy, and the Germans were on the side of barbarity. It was a far more complicated picture than that.
Do you know it takes 4 days to embargo back to the former in Chile?
I don't know. The point is that it's a far more messy picture than reality will, than you might think. The reality is a far more complicated, or history is a far more complicated object than the slogans and the commemorations will have you know. I mean, I've said this at Speaker's Corner multiple times. If you go down that direction, down Park Lane, you'll find a wonderful war memorial to all the animals that died in World War II. I believe it's either World War II or World War I. I can't remember quite which one it is. You have the elephant, you have the donkey. I'm sure you've all seen it. You know the one I'm talking about. Lovely memorial. I love animals. It's very sad what happened. All those dogs sent into war zones to try and, I don't know, they're carrying messages or carrying bombs. I don't know. It's tragic. However, you'll be hard pressed to find a memorial to what happened in the Bengal famine, when millions of people in the northeast of India were subject to a brutal regime by the British Empire that starved them of the food they needed. Where Churchill was ordering food to be taken out of India. Where the Canadians offered to send grain to India, but the British didn't let them. This was all to divert resources away from India and towards Britain for the war effort. Millions of Indians dead in this famine. You won't find a single memorial to this. Because among academics, it's all too well known that Churchill had a significant part in engineering that famine. That he allowed it to happen or he enabled it to happen. He also had the scorched earth policy, where you had endless amounts of rice and grain destroyed in case the Japanese would somehow take over that part of India. That was a policy pursued by Britain in that period. It didn't matter that there was a famine going on, that people were dying in the streets, people were dying of famine-related diseases. You won't find a memorial to that famine in England. If you can find one, I'd be interested to hear about it. I haven't found one. But there is one for animals. This gives you an idea of how we privilege our commemorations. We put animals, donkeys, elephants and so on above the value of human lives in places like Bengal. That should be a stirring kind of, it makes me angry. That's how I feel about it. I feel annoyed. I feel like that the British elite are negating a basic responsibility by only focusing on the crimes of enemies and not focusing on their own role in creating disasters, wars, and conflicts. We're not doing ourselves any favors. It's not a positive message we want to send to the rest of the world. We want to respect as a country, I think. Come over here, I can't hear you, man. Well, yeah, there is a bit of silence on that history. I mean, there was a massive ethnic cleansing.